Good day. I'm Justin Russell. I am the Principal Director of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, based here in Washington, D.C. This is the latest in our webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about the unique relationship between the United Arab Emirates and the United States. Quite frankly, the relationship between the United States and the United Arab Emirates is a unique one. In many foreign policy circles, the relationship is at best referred to as unique or complicated. At worst, it is referred to as codependent. Either way, the relationship continues to be a focal point in the foreign policy of the United States, for better or for worse. In recent years, there's been pressure on this key strategic relationship. On one hand, the number of cases citing human rights abuses perpetrated by the Emiratis continues to grow, and their documented aggression in the region, namely in Yemen and Libya, continues to draw international furor. On the other hand, the recent Abraham Accords puts them in the spotlight by enhancing a peaceful recognition and dialogue between the UAE and Israel. While the U.S. continues to consider the UAE its strongest partner on the Arabian Peninsula, the relationship between the Emiratis, Russians, and China is growing closer and stronger every day. So where does that put this relationship? Is the relationship sustainable? Is the relationship a strength or a liability to Washington? What will the relationship look like in the future? Well, we're going to talk about this complicated relationship in our discussion today. But first, allow me to introduce our distinguished panel. First off, we have Raed Jarrar. Raed is an Arab American political advocate based in Washington, D.C. Since immigrating to the U.S. in 2005, he has worked as a lobbyist on political issues pertaining to U.S. engagement in the Arab world. He is widely recognized as an expert on political, social, and economic developments in the MENA region. He has testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings and is a frequent guest on national and international media outlets in both Arabic and English, including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, etc. He has been published in the New York Times and quoted in numerous media outlets. Raed was raised in countries all across the Middle East. He's a graduate of the University of Baghdad, where he received his bachelor's degree, and the University of Jordan, where he received his master's degree, both in architecture and engineering. He is on the advisory board of the organization Air Wars and comes to us today representing democracy in the Arab world now. Raed, thank you so much for joining us, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
Next up here, Jordan Cohen. Jordan is a policy analyst at the Cato Institute and a Ph.D. candidate in political science at George Mason University. His work focuses on issues related to weapons transfers, alliances, Middle East politics, and military budget. Jordan is an emerging expert at the Forum on the Arms Trade and is the co-author on the Cato Institute's Arms Sales Risk Index. He has published over 20 op-eds, 3 think tank reports, 2 peer-reviewed journal articles, 2 peer-reviewed book reviews, and has given multiple media interviews. This includes placements at the War on the Rocks, NBC News, The Hill, Yahoo News, and a series of publications at Defense One and similar defense analysis outlets. His work has been cited in several media outlets, including Washington Quarterly, the American Academic of Pediatrics, the Academic Journal regarding on how to mitigate child casualties in conflict, as well as various other think tanks and think tank reports. His work has also been cited by Senator Ben Cardin in the announcement of the Enhancing Human Rights in Arms Sales Act of 2019. Jordan has wide-ranging regional experience, specifically in the Middle East. He owns a professional competency in Arabic and has published on the relationship between oil and regime stability in the U.S. or in the Middle East. In his free time, Jordan is a fan of Chelsea Football Club, Go Blue, and Cleveland sports. Okay, that kind of works. Including hosting a podcast about the Cleveland Browns. Wow, that's an offline discussion we got to have, Jordan. He currently holds a master's in Middle East and Islamic Studies for George Mason and holds a bachelor's in history from High Point University. First of all, thank you for joining us, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah. So let's start off with the basics here. You heard me talk about the relationship with the United Arab Emirates being complicated. Raed, let's start off with you and say, how did we get to this point in U.S. Emirati relations, and exactly in your opinion, how complicated is it?
It's complicated as much as many other complicated relationships. I think unfortunately, the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa is complicated in as much as it's failed and incoherent and contradictory. I think many of us have criticized the United States foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa region for a long time now, whether it was the U.S. engagement with countries like Egypt or Israel or countries in the Gulf region. And the relationship with the UAE in that sense is not unique to it being a contradictory and unclear kind of a relationship where the United States flip-flops, where the U.S. supports a country in many cases against the U.S. On interest or regulations or laws. We've seen this happening with Saudi Arabia, with Bahrain, with other countries in the region. So with UAE, honestly, the last couple of weeks have been also very clear, gave us a clear example of how the U.S. relationship with UAE is a failed relationship. And the word complicated is really masking what is more of a failure of an incoherent relationship that is on autopilot. We saw that the U.S. pushed very, very hard for a top priority issue regarding Ukraine, and UAE just happened to be in the Security Council as one of the members in this period. And the UAE did not take the United States side in the initial 2 or 3 votes. Everyone around the world was shocked at how could this happen? How could the US and UAE be involved in arms deals amounting to tens of billions of dollars? How could the US be this engaged politically and supportive? And then when this critical moment of an international conflict breaks, there is no coherence in coordination with the UAE. This was just an example of how the US relationship with the UAE is failed. We have seen many other examples throughout the years, especially in the war on Yemen, where the United Arab Emirates intervention has not been in coordination with the US. It has not been within the US interest. It was, and the US continues to support UAE and sell weapons to the United Arab Emirates despite that.
Right. Jordan, same question to you is, how do you view the complicated relationship between Washington and the Emiratis, and how, in your view, did we get here?
Yeah, so just to kind of further that, when people talk about weapon sales and alliances, partnerships, there's a lot of conversation that, oh, this gives the United States leverage over these countries. I actually think the opposite is true. And looking specifically at the case of the UAE, if anything, it seems like the UAE is the one that has leverage over the United States. And this relationship with the UAE goes back a very, very long way. But I mean, what's happening right now is connected to the global war on terror just as much as it is to anything else. One of the big reasons and one of the big types of weapons systems we're sending the UAE are these weapons, these missiles that are designed to let the UAE conduct over-the-horizon operations in Afghanistan. the connections run deep. The reason the U.S. agreed to send $65 million more in weapons is because they intercepted an airstrike from Yemen going into the UAE. It's all connected.
So along those lines, though, Jordan, is, you know, we still hear the commentary that the UAE is our strongest ally in the Arabian Peninsula. That being the case, are they truly acting like our strongest ally in the Arabian Peninsula, or is it in fact a situation where the Emiratis are in fact, they look out for themselves and what's in the best interest of the Emiratis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the latter, right? And to a certain degree, I mean, given the U.S. collection of allies in the Arabian Peninsula, they may actually be the most loyal, but that's not saying much, right? I mean, that's coming in 214th place in 215-person race. And at the end of the day, they are not looking out for U.S. interest. Again, if anything, they use U.S. interest against the United States. So like a big example is, oh, well, turns out UAE weapons U.S. has given the UAE are falling into the hands of al-Qaeda-linked organizations. So then the UAE says, well, we need more like radar capability, more tracking capability to make sure that doesn't happen. And then the U.S. sends millions of dollars of radar and stuff, and it keeps happening. And
just for clarification for the viewers, I should disclose the fact the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs is in fact a plaintiff in a federal court case trying to block the sale of the F-35s and other armaments to the United Nations. It is still before, to the United Arab Emirates. It is still before a federal judge in Washington, D.C. So I do want to make that perfectly clear that we are, in fact, we do have a case before a federal judge on that. But Raed, here's the thing is going back to what Jordan was saying is that it strikes me that the advantage that the UAE, for some reason, has this underlying control over Middle East foreign policy, both over the White House, both over the State Department, and even with the Department of Defense. Is this a marriage of convenience? Is this a marriage of necessity? Or is this the relationship that this is the one that, for lack of a better term, sucks less, if you will?
And I think unfortunately, it's all the above. Like most of the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, including that with UAE, is on autopilot. And many of the think tanks and nonprofits in DC have been criticizing what appears to be a policy that is just happening for the sake of happening. We give Egypt $1.3 billion a year and give Israel $3.8 billion a year because of some arrangements stemming from the 1970s. And many think tanks in DC, including, like the Brand Corporation, that is like more of a centrist corporation, put a really good report last year saying we really need to rethink and shift the United States engagement in the Middle East. I think with the UAE, it's a combination of many of the factors that you mentioned. Some of it has to do with the flow of arms and the military-industrial complex, just selling billions of dollars, and the whole economic angle behind that. Members of Congress and corporations saying this is good for jobs, it's good for money, we're making money out of this. So that's just like the unrestricted flow of arms is one part. The other part is the whole situation with Iran, and many members of Congress and policymakers view UAE and Saudi Arabia as like a part of that proxy war against or tension with Iran in the region, because UAE is more closer to the United States and now closer to Israel because of US pressure. So there are a lot of bigger picture excuses for that. But when you look at the actual relationship, why is the United States allying itself with a government that is committing human rights abuses at home and committing war crimes in Yemen, in Libya, supporting dictatorships around the region, supporting counter-revolutions around the Arab world? Why is the United States affiliating itself with that? There is no answer. The real answer is that the United States is only giving a blind eye to that. Like, we're not looking at it. There is, intentionally not recognizing that the UAE policies in the region are in contradiction to the US stated policies.
Well, Jordan, that brings up a huge point to us. When we look at the UAE, we've seen the documented use of arms in Yemen, in Libya, and the continuous violations of human rights. But for the month of March, ironically, at the chair of the United Nations Security Council is, in fact, the United Arab Emirates. Is there a weird dichotomy involved in this, seeing that the UAE isn't so much worried about global peace and global security as it is about maintaining its power over the GCC?
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate bit too is I don't think the U.S. is that concerned about it, right? And you can look at
why is that? Let's just get down to the root of it. Why is that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. I think because no matter how much U.S. politicians and U.S. businesses, et cetera, want to say they really evaluate human rights or it's whatever in their analysis, at the end of the day, I think one of the only real positive things about Henry Kissinger was he came out and said, like, we're not interested in that, right? We're interested in stability. And I hazard to think that I really do believe that that's true. I don't think the U.S. actually cares about human rights. And I think the reason we know that is just look at all the weapons U.S. is sending to everywhere, whether it's the Northern Triangle, the Gulf, knowing what these weapons are going to be used for. And it's a never-ending cycle. We don't stop doing it. And it's unfortunate.
And Reed, it almost seems like that the American electorate is also falling prey to this wide global marketing extravaganza that is the UAE. Americans continue to look at Dubai and Abu Dhabi as these luxurious places where everybody is treated equal in luxury. Nobody realizes the true hurt that comes out of those places when it comes to human rights abuses involving sex trade, involving indentured servitude, the mistreatment of transitional employees. Why is it that we are allowing a marketing campaign to kind of defeat what is truly good in the world, and that is the rightful human rights of people in the region?
These are very legitimate questions, and like looking at the human rights abuses inside of UAE, they're one of the best kept secrets in DC. Like, UAE is a small country of only 1 million citizens, but there are 8 million migrant workers who work there, often in abusive conditions. There are abusive laws for keeping them there, abusive conditions for how they live, and very serious human rights violations that happen on a daily basis. They mostly fly under the radar because the United States government doesn't amplify them. We don't really hear that much about them. So you're right. Like, when you think about Dubai and Abu Dhabi and the fancy malls, and there is this fascination with viewing Dubai through these like tourism lenses, without digging deeper to see what's going on under everyone's, under the radar there. I think it's not very surprising to see this. There is a pattern out there where the United States government tends to criticize human rights abuses in countries that we don't like. If these kind of abuses were happening in Iran or in China or in Russia, we would have heard about them more than the abuses happening in Israel or in Egypt or Saudi Arabia or UAE or other abusive governments. So like there is a bigger foreign policy problem that we're dealing with. And I think the issues that we are pointing out in the case of UAE is a manifestation of that issue. But here's what we can say. If you look at the human rights reports by most human rights organizations, international, global human rights organizations, whether it's Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or other human rights authorities out there, there are very clear indications, very clear documented cases of serious human rights violations, systemic human rights violations that happen internally in UAE. Even my organization, Dawn, we have documented some of these violations. We have highlighted a few cases of unjust prosecutions in the United Arab Emirates, some cases of culprits. And I encourage your viewers to go to our website, dawnmena, DAWNMENA.org, to view some of these cases. So, like, they have been documented. And I think that the war crimes that the UAE is committing in Yemen and in Libya, they're very extremely serious. I mean, the UAE literally occupies entire islands, entire parts of Yemen, supports some factions against other factions, in many cases against the U.S. stated policies in Yemen, bombs, destroys. It's unbelievable. The intervention in Yemen is really out of control. And the fact that they also have a direct intervention to support Sisi and the dictatorship in Egypt by bombing Libya, and interventions in Tunis and Tunisia. I mean, it's unbelievable. Like UAE in the Arab world has become a symbol of supporting counter-revolutionary, anti-democratic forces around the Arab world. And the United States has not criticized these actions, not even once over the last decade.
And Jordan, that being the case, and Raed, I want to come back to that point, but there's one thing that all of these war criminal, the alleged war crimes being undertaken by the UAE, Jordan, when we talk about this, is the concern that, if we don't have the UAE as an ally, this could put into jeopardy certain strategic plans, let's say from the Biden administration, such as reinstating the JCPOA, the Iranian deal. Is this a factor, or are we overreading on this?
I mean, I would hazard to say I think any relations with UAE may make something like the JCPOA more difficult, right? Because, I mean, Iran buys weapons from Russia in response to when the U.S. sends weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I think that the strategic narrative is just based on decades and decades of the U.S. belief, and this goes beyond the global war on terror. It goes through the Cold War of the U.S. adopting this kind of very primacist grand strategy where they don't feel that, like, this idea that we have left the Middle East is absurd. If anything, leaving Afghanistan increased our presence everywhere else across the region. And so it's decades of this same foreign policy that, as much as Biden talked a good game and continues to do so, he hasn't really changed much, especially when it comes to sending weapons and relationships.
But I guess the fear is that, this is almost kind of Godfather Ask Jordan, where we say, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Is the fear that if we don't continue to keep that military relationship with the Emiratis in place, that they will, in fact, go into the arms of manufacturers such as, let's say, Russia?
I mean, if that is the logic, then these countries are less intelligent than I think we're giving them credit for. Transitioning to Russian weaponry would be exceedingly difficult. It would be exceedingly costly. And I think the US knows that. And I think the UAE knows that, right? These countries know that US weapons give them the best ability to do what they want to do, and they're willing to pay the premium for it. And I mean, when I've looked at the history of US weapon sales and like when those sales reduce or end, basically since the beginning of the global war on terror. And the answer is, as long as these countries are willing to pay money for these giant weapon systems, the US is going to be willing to sell. When the countries stop being willing to pay the money, then the US stops. But as long as the US is willing to pay.
But you know, Raed, we've seen this as recently as the recent Dubai Air Show, where we saw the Emiratis and the Emirati regime snuggling up to Chinese arms manufacturers, Russian arms manufacturers, and U.S. arms manufacturers. We've always heard that the reason why we want to keep this relationship with the UAE is because they're loyal to our cause, they're loyal to our brand, and they recognize the quality. Are we being sold a bill of goods when it comes to the depth of the relationship, especially when it comes from a national strategic angle?
I mean, I have to say that in this country, and I can't speak to Russia and China and other countries, but in this country, we do have very clear regulations for who we can sell weapons to. There are clear US laws and regulations and policies that prohibits the United States government from selling weapons to human rights abusers or to any country that will use the weapons to commit war crimes. So we have two main bodies of law. One of them is the Foreign Assistance Act. It has many amendments. It's been there for decades. And it applies to when the U.S. Mostly gives other countries military aid.
Right.
And there is the Arms Export Control Act that applies to when we sell weapons to other countries. And there are a few other smaller presidential policies and executive director. The U.S. is technically a signatory to the Arms Transfer Treaty, the ATT, but it has not been ratified yet, so it's not in fact. But you would think that the administration would follow the spirit of it as well, because the Obama administration is the one who signed the treaty. So there are guidelines there, and it's true that there are many arguments that could be made for why weapon manufacturers would like to sell more weapons. I mean, I believe that. I think all weapon manufacturers would like to sell more weapons to anyone. But I think there is the political argument for why the United States should or should not sell weapons to some governments, and then there is the legal argument. And I think the New York Center is using both of these arguments in your lawsuit,
right,
which is,
right.
We shouldn't be selling these weapons to the UAE, not only because of the political analysis that we have, which is this is not a good idea to support this government by giving them legitimacy, but also because of the legal restraints that we have there. Now, that said, I do want to emphasize a point that was made earlier by you, Justin, which the point about the interoperation of different weapons between the US and other countries. And it's actually a myth that if we didn't sell the UAE one more F-22, that they're gonna turn to the other side and get a Russian Sukhoi instead. It doesn't work that way. These things take decades of training and switching weapons, and it's a much more complex situation. And it is that language is usually used to justify impulsive selling that contradicts with US policies and laws. Say if we didn't sell it, the Russians would sell it, or China would sell it. I personally think the answer is let them. So what? Like that's for me, that's not like really an issue. Like if the conversation that we're having is that we have an abusive government that is committing very serious violations domestically and war crimes in the region, that we shouldn't sell them weapons. That's the end of the conversation. Are they going to buy their weapons from another country? Are they going to coordinate with someone else to commit their war crimes? Let them do it. I don't understand why is that a part of us stepping in to sell it. But I'm saying, like, I understand that the conversation in DC is more complex. And for that conversations, we step in to say, we need more safeguards, we need more systems of transparency, and we need better end-use monitoring to make sure that US weapons will not be used to committing these violations. And at the same time, even for those who want to sell weapons and transfer weapons to Egypt and UAE and Saudi Arabia and Israel, for the US to at least use some leverage if we are actually selling these weapons. It's the worst of both worlds now, because we dump hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons for Saudi Arabia and UAE and Egypt with almost zero leverage. I mean, this week's events at the Security Council is an example of a failed US policy. The United States is unable to get the UAE to agree to the most basic principles of international law while the UAE is in the Security Council to stop an armed invasion of a member of the UN. It's unbelievable how little the United States has of leverage over these countries that has been covering up for and justifying supporting for decades.
Jordan, Reed brings up a really good point. We talk about the special relationship between the Emiratis and Washington, yet as Reed pointed out, they abstained along with other non-friendly, let's say, U.S. actors or non-supportive U.S. actors in the General Assembly's emergency resolution on Ukraine. We have seen a stronger relationship between Moscow and Abu Dhabi and Moscow and Dubai continuing to grow. At the same time, we see the human rights violations. The New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs back in 2020, we broke the report that said that the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Treasury were in fact investigating the UAE Central Bank for money laundering to allow people to do work in Iran, contrary to our own sanctions, contrary to our own laws, and yet we continue to reward this. I guess the big question is, what has to happen for us to hold the Emiratis accountable for all these actions? And, we've tried carrot. When do they see a stick, or will they?
Yeah, I mean, this idea that U.S. weapons gives the U.S. U.S. weapon sales gives the U.S. leverage over these countries. I mean, at this point, to me, seems a little bit like Bigfoot. Like we keep that is said over and over in DC policy circles, whether it's talking about Saudi Arabia or the UAE or what have you. And the reality is, we don't do it. We haven't done it for 20 years. If we were using these weapons as leverage somewhere across the world, we should see these weapons leading to more democratic freedoms, less human rights abuses, and we don't do it. We don't see it. And largely it's because the F-35 isn't there to make peace, right? The F-16 isn't to make peace, it's to kill. And when the US agrees to these contracts, it is politicians feel bound to continue the sale because of the potential loss of money if they cancel halfway through. Congress doesn't have the legs right now because of the presidential veto present in the Arms Export Control Act. They don't have the legs. I think we are all aware there are many Congress people that do not like these sales, that issue RFDs, resolutions for disapproval of these sales. And whether it gets shut down in Congress or it gets shut down by the president's veto, they don't work. And so I don't believe weapon sales are giving the U.S. leverage. I think the opposite is true. I think when the U.S. starts these sales, a country like the UAE has leverage over the United States.
We mentioned in the opening about the Abrams Accords. How important is the Abrams Accords, or was this just basically smoke and mirrors, paid for play diplomacy? Raed, I'll start with you.
I mean, I think the Abrams Accords are an example for why the United States continues to support UAE for the wrong reasons. What happened was that we saw that the pro-Israel lobby stepped in to celebrate this agreement between UAE and Israel. The agreement came with a price that the pro-Israel lobby in the US, AIPAC, and other groups would give the United Arab Emirates additional support or protections here in the US. It's like a blank check for more abusive policies. There were some conversations before that if the UAE were to enter the Abrams Accords or the treaties, that they would receive more US weapons in response, that they will get like F-22s in response, that they're going to get F-18s in response. This is awful. It's just an awful example of how regional politics and what Israel wants in the region ends up directing the United States policy in the region. So this is also a part of the problem here, like whether it's the United Arab Emirates employing their own lobbyist firms in DC, and they spend millions of dollars on their lobbying firms, pressuring the US government and manipulating our foreign policy. They also now have an alliance with the pro-Israel lobby in DC that is also pushing to whitewash the crimes of UAE and make it look better. It is really a part of the problem. It is a part of the problem that we have these special interest groups who are directly paid by UAE or who are politically motivated by the pro-Israel lobby, who now are, whitewashing and promoting this image of the United Arab Emirates being an important ally. What happened after the Abrams Accord? Nothing happened. Is there peace in the region? Is the Israeli apartheid less painful to Palestinians? Is there a better arrangement between Palestinians and any of their neighbors, between Palestinians and Israelis? Nothing happened. It's literally just a publicity stunt, political signaling for this regrouping in the region that is not really affecting any of the United States' stated policies or interests. It's not bringing about any change. Like some people talk about what happened between Israel and UAE as a peace treaty, as if UAE and Israel were at war or something, and then the US helped them to come to peace. That was never the case. I think that it was an overblown publicity stunt that came with a heavy price. The heavy price is we're not going to criticize the UAE's crimes. The heavy price is that we're going to give the UAE more weapons and more political support. And it's not a good deal.
Right. Jordan, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely do. I think when we go to talk about some of the more recent weapon sales that U.S. is giving to the UAE that Israel is supporting, Israel also knows that at a certain point, that means U.S. has to give Israel even more, because the U.S. has kind of this blanket commitment to make sure Israel has the strongest military. So Israel knows what it's getting itself into, and the Trump administration, who quote unquote fostered these accords, they were coming out saying they solved Middle East peace. It was. I think it's exactly right. It's a publicity stunt. It's no more. It's a publicity stunt by all parties.
Very good. I got two last questions here. One, real quickly, is do you guys think that the growing UAE-China relationship has had an impact on the strategic thinking in regards to U.S. Emirati relations? Raed?
I can't really speak to that. Like, I'm not an expert on what's going on with between UAE and China. I know that the UAE has many different relationships with different countries around the world, as reliant on the US as, like, say, Egypt or Jordan. But I'm not very familiar with the UAE relationships with China.
Okay. Jordan, can you tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, so this administration has really kind of doubled down on this "we're gonna balance China" kind of thing. And so I hear the argument. The problem is the US relationship with UAE has been very closely connected for a lot longer than the US cared about China. Right? I mean, from 2001 to 2016, the US didn't really care much about China. It was they were more concerned about policy in the Middle East. And so you would assume you would see a difference, right? If that's what the cause was, but I don't think so. I don't think so.
Okay. Final question. Where does the relationship go from here? Has there been enough strain put on it? Is there enough evidence globally of human rights abuses, acts of aggression in, regionally and even further out, the money laundering, the corruption, et cetera? Is there enough strain to at least call the attention to the relationship, and where does the relationship go from here? Jordan, we'll start with you.
I mean, I think it's very deeply tied into the U.S. weapons sales relationship across the world. So I think,
is that let me just jump in. Is that the baseline in your mind? Is that everything stems from F-35s, UAVs, and ordnance?
Well, I think it is no, but I do think it is a big thing in our partnerships in the Middle East. I think a lot of these countries work with the US because the US ostensibly is giving them a military. And I don't think the US is going to stop doing that, because no matter what the Biden administration says, we haven't left the Middle East. And again, it doesn't seem like we made a really significant departure. So I unfortunately, and there are things that can change it, right? I think whether it's kind of legally or through new legislation that does put restrictions on it, I think it is possible to stop it, but I'm pessimistic, at least for the short term.
Raed, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to change by itself. Like, the United States government is not going to hold the United States government accountable. I think there are three things that can change it. The first one is, and many of our groups are involved in this. The first one is implementing existing U.S. laws and policies, because we do have very good laws and policies on the books that are not implemented, and the UAE should not be receiving weapons from the United States, because it is an abusive government that is using these weapons for to commit human rights violations and war crimes around the region. Number two is introducing new legislation. As Jordan said, like, there are 2 or 3 pieces of legislation floating around the Senate and House for this Congress to improve our systems of accountability, to center human rights in any arms transfer around the region. And these are also important. And the third thing is what the New York Center is doing now, which is lawsuits, actually suing our own government for failing to abide by its own policies and by our own laws. I think that is extremely important. It's very, very effective to push for this impact litigation, because it's time to tell our government here it's not okay to continue business as usual. It is time to rethink our engagement with the Middle East and North Africa in general, with UAE in particular.
Very good. Raed Jarrar, our friends at Dawn, thank you as always. Jordan Cohen, our friends at Cato, again, thank you as always. Really appreciate your insight into this. I do want to give a special shout out to Lauren Maltese, our Associate Director for External Affairs, who put this entire program together. I also want to shout out to Valentina Doran, who continuously makes me look smarter than I actually am. I also want to, you've seen an additional member of our team here at the center on the camera, our newly elected Secretary of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, Rachel Rudolph. Rachel, as always, it's great to see you, ma'am. Thanks for joining us as part of this discussion. You can download this at any time from our website, www.nycfpa.org. You can also catch it on our social media feeds on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And LinkedIn. Can't forget LinkedIn. You can also get the latest on our events and our continuing webinar series. We're having our first luncheon series, kind of tied into this, basically talking about the growing arms race that's happening in the Middle East. That will be happening at the end of March, early April. We'll have details of that on our website. But as always, on behalf of the board of directors, the staff, the team, and everybody at the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, I'm Justin Russell. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you at our new event or our next events coming up soon. Take care.